The radio crackled with the kind of silence that meant death was coming. In the Black Mountains of Khorasan Valley, 250 Marines had exactly 17 minutes of ammunition left before the enemy overran their position. Every pilot on base had been grounded, every rescue mission denied, every hope extinguished. But in the corner of the command tent, a woman they'd written off as just a supply pilot was about to remind them what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, call sign Viper, wasn't asking for permission anymore. The engines of Hawk 11 were already spinning up, and in 60 seconds, she would either save them all or die trying. Tonight, the sky belonged to the pilot they never saw coming. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? 3 days earlier, Naval Air Station Sentinel had been just another forward operating base in a war that seemed to drag on without end. The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains gold. But inside the operations center, the mood was anything but bright. Intelligence reports streamed across multiple screens, enemy movements, weather patterns, supply convoy schedules. All routine, all predictable. Commander Rachel Torres stood at the main briefing table, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of keyboards and radio chatter. New personnel assignments, effective immediately. She consulted her tablet, reading names with military precision. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, reporting for logistics and supply operations. From the back of the room, Captain Marcus Webb looked up from his coffee, raising an eyebrow. Chen? Never heard of her. His tone carried that particular brand of dismissiveness reserved for personnel he deemed unimportant. Webb commanded the gunship squadron Razor Flight, and in his mind, nothing mattered except combat missions. She's transferring in from Pearl Harbor. Torres continued. Extensive helicopter experience. She'll be handling our supply runs to the forward outposts. Supply runs. The words hung in the air like a judgment. In Webb's world, supply runs meant safe flights, predictable routes, and pilots who couldn't cut it in real combat. He exchanged a knowing glance with his wingman, Captain Dave Morrison. Both men had flown combat missions for over a decade. Both had earned their reputations in the fire of actual warfare. Hope she can handle the mountain thermals, Morrison muttered, loud enough for others to hear. Supply birds get tossed around like toys up there. What none of them knew, what Sarah Chen had made sure they wouldn't know, was that the woman walking across the tarmac at that very moment had once been called the person with the maid, most lethal helicopter pilot in naval special warfare. That her previous assignment hadn't been logistics at Pearl Harbor. But something so classified it didn't officially exist. That the supply runs she'd be flying were about to become the least important thing she'd do at Sentinel Base. Sandra approached the operations center with the measured stride of someone who'd learned to move through military spaces without drawing attention. She wore standard flight fatigues, her helmet bag slung over one shoulder, face calm and unremarkable. At first glance, she looked like exactly what her orders claimed, a logistics pilot being rotated into a routine assignment. She paused at the entry checkpoint, presenting her ID to the young airman on duty. Lieutenant Commander Chen, reporting for assignment. The airman barely glanced at her credentials before waving her through. Operations Center's straight ahead, ma'am. Commander Torres is expecting you. As she walked through the corridor, Sandra's eyes automatically cataloged details others would miss. Emergency exit locations. Communication equipment. The slight lag in the radio traffic that suggested their long-range comms were running through a repeater. Old habits from a previous life she'd supposedly left behind. The operations center buzzed with controlled chaos. Officers hunched over tactical displays, their faces lit by the blue glow of satellite feeds. Radio operators managed multiple channels simultaneously, their voices blending into a symphony of military efficiency. Sandra took it all in with the practiced eye of someone who'd commanded similar facilities under far more dangerous circumstances. Lieutenant Commander Chen, Commander Torres approached, extending her hand. Welcome to Sentinel. I trust your flight from Pearl was uneventful. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Sandra's handshake was firm but brief. Professional. Unremarkable. Your quarters are in Building C, and your aircraft assignment is Hawk 11. She's a reliable bird, well-maintained. You'll be working primarily with Sergeant Cole and his maintenance crew. Torres gestured toward the flight line visible through the operations center windows. The morning briefing covers your flight routes and supply schedules. Through the glass, Sandra could see rows of helicopters sitting on the concrete apron. Most were standard transport models, but her eyes lingered on the gunships, parked at the far end, sleek Predators that looked like they were built for hunting rather than hauling cargo. Any questions about your assignment? Torres asked. Sandra shook her head. No, ma'am. When do I start? Tomorrow at 0800. Get settled in tonight. Torres turned back to her duties, already moving on to the next item on her endless list of responsibilities. But as Sandra left the operations center, she caught fragments of conversation from the pilots clustered around the coffee station. Their voices carried the casual confidence of men who'd never been truly tested, who mistook routine for competence. Supply runs, one of them was saying. At least we know she won't get in our way during real missions. Sandra didn't react, didn't acknowledge she'd heard. She simply collected her gear and headed toward her assigned quarters. But as she walked across the base in the fading light, her hand unconsciously brushed against a small, faded tattoo on her wrist. Twin wings wrapped around 3 letters, JTW. The reminder of a promise she'd made 2 years ago, in another war zone, over the grave of a co-pilot who died because she hadn't been fast enough. The mountains around Sentinel Base were beautiful in the twilight, their peaks catching the last rays of sun. But Sandra knew that beauty was deceptive. In 72 hours, those same mountains would echo with gunfire, and the men who'd dismissed her as just a supply pilot would learn that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones nobody sees coming. She unpacked her few belongings in the sterile efficiency of military quarters. Standard issue furniture, regulation bedding, everything designed for temporary occupation. But on her nightstand, she placed a single photograph, 2 pilots in flight gear, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera beside their aircraft. The man in the photo wore a name patch reading L.T. J. T. Walker. The woman was younger, her eyes bright with the confidence of someone who believed nothing could touch her. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone who understood that the most important battles are often fought by people no one expects to fight them. Sandra Chen had come to Sentinel Base for reasons that went far beyond supply runs and routine logistics. And in the darkness, gathering over the Hindu Kush, those reasons were about to matter more than anyone could imagine. The morning briefing room smelled of burnt coffee and the particular staleness that comes from too many people breathing recirculated air. Sandra sat in the back row, notebook open, pen ready, the picture of a dutiful logistics pilot preparing for another routine day. Around her, the real pilots, as they thought of themselves, occupied the front seats with the casual arrogance of kings holding court. Commander Torres stood at the podium, cycling through the day's operational requirements. Weather conditions are marginal, visibility dropping to 3 miles in the mountain passes. All non-essential flights are grounded until further notice. Captain Webb leaned back in his chair, his flight suit bearing the patches of a dozen combat deployments. Define non-essential, he said with a smirk. Because some of us have real missions to fly. A ripple of laughter went through the front rows. These men had earned their confidence through years of combat operations, countless missions where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. In their world, supply runs weren't real flying, they were taxi service with rotor blades. All scheduled logistics flights are suspended, Torres clarified. That includes supply runs to Firebase, Alpha, and the northern observation posts. Sandra made a note in her pad, her expression neutral, but her mind was already calculating wind patterns, analyzing the weather data displayed on the screens around the room. Marginal conditions weren't impossible conditions, not for someone with her background, not for someone who'd flown through sandstorms in Iraq and monsoons in Southeast Asia on missions that officially never happened. After the briefing, the pilots clustered around the flight schedule board, discussing their assignments with the casual expertise of professionals who knew their worth. Sandra approached to check her canceled routes, hoping to slip by unnoticed. Well, Captain Morrison spotted her first. The supply lady. Guess you get a day off, huh? Several heads turned. In the harsh fluorescent light, Sandra looked exactly like what her file claimed, a mid-career officer with a logistics specialty and a clean but unremarkable service record. Nothing about her suggested the classified operations she'd once commanded, the impossible mission she'd completed when failure meant more than embarrassment. Yes, sir, she replied simply. Weather conditions don't look favorable for the northern routes. Webb stepped closer, his presence deliberately intimidating. At 6'2", with the build of someone who spent his off-duty hours in the base gym, he was accustomed to physical dominance. You know, Keen, those mountain passes can be tricky even in good weather. Hope you're ready for some real flying out here. The implication was clear. She wasn't. The other pilots watched with the detached interest of spectators at a one-sided contest. This was how hierarchies were established, how pecking orders were maintained. The new pilot would be tested, found wanting, and relegated to her proper place in the ecosystem. I'm sure I'll manage, Sandra said, her tone remaining neutral. Morrison chuckled. That's what they all say. Until they hit their first downdraft at 8,000 feet with a full cargo load. He turned to his wingman. Remember that pilot from Davis Monthan? Thought he was hot stuff until he got bounced around like a ping-pong ball in Sector 7. Nearly lost the bird, Webb agreed. Some people just aren't cut out for mountain flying. Takes a special kind of pilot. The circle of pilots nodded knowingly. They'd all earned their wings the hard way, through training that broke lesser candidates and operational deployments that sorted the competent from the exceptional. In their minds, Sandra Keen was an unknown quantity at best, a potential liability at worst. You flown combat operations before, Keen? The question came from Captain Torres, no relation to the base commander, a gunship pilot with the lean build of a marathon runner and eyes that had seen too much combat. Sandra paused, choosing her words carefully. Some overseas deployments. Nothing like what you gentlemen have experienced. I'm sure. It was technically true, and completely misleading. Her overseas deployments had included deep reconnaissance missions in denied territory, extractions under enemy fire, and operations so sensitive they were briefed only to personnel with compartmentalized clearances. But those missions didn't exist in her official record, couldn't be discussed in open conversation, and wouldn't be believed even if she tried to explain them. Well, Webb said, his voice carrying false encouragement, I'm sure you'll do fine with the supply runs. Important work, keeping the forward bases stocked with coffee and toilet paper. More laughter. Sandra nodded politely, understanding that this was the price of maintaining her cover. She'd accepted this assignment knowing she'd be underestimated, knowing that her true capabilities would remain hidden until circumstances forced her to reveal them. Actually, Morrison added, warming to the subject, supply runs are probably the best assignment for you. Keep you out of trouble while the real pilots handle the dangerous stuff. Sandra closed her notebook and prepared to leave. I'll let you get back to your mission planning, gentlemen. But Webb wasn't finished. You know, Keen, I've been flying combat missions for 12 years. Seen a lot of pilots wash out when things got tough. The mountain weather out here, it separates the wheat from the chaff real quick. He moved closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was helpful advice. My recommendation? Stick to the safe routes. Don't try to be a hero. Leave the dangerous flying to those of us who've proven we can handle it. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, conversations had quieted as other personnel sensed the tension. Sandra met Webb's gaze steadily, her expression giving away nothing of the calculations running through her mind. She was measuring him, cataloging his tells, identifying the arrogance that would one day put his crew in danger. "I appreciate the advice, Captain," she said finally. "I'll keep it in mind." As she walked away, she heard Webb's voice carrying across the room. "Some pilots, you can just tell they're not cut out for the real thing. Too cautious, too worried about following the rules." The irony was perfect. In 72 hours, when 250 Marines were trapped in a kill zone and every rule in the book said they couldn't be saved, Sarah Chen would demonstrate exactly how wrong Webb's assessment had been. But for now, she let the dismissal stand. Let them believe they'd taken the measure of the quiet logistics pilot who knew her place. In her quarters that night, Sandra sat on the edge of her regulation bunk, staring at the photograph of her and JTW. The laughter from the ready room still echoed in her memory, mixing with older echoes from a mission 2 years ago when overconfidence had cost her the best co-pilot she'd ever flown with. She touched the faded patch sewn inside her flight suit wings, wrapped around those 3 letters, and made herself a promise. When the time came, when lives hung in the balance, and the real pilots found themselves out of their depth, she would be ready. The men who'd mocked her preparation would learn that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones you never see coming. Outside her window, the mountains stood silent against the stars, keeping their secrets. But change was coming to the Hindu Kush, and Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen would be at the center of it. The next morning brought exactly the kind of weather that separated confident pilots from competent ones. Low-hanging clouds wrapped around the mountain peaks like gray scarves, and the wind carried the sharp bite of an approaching storm. The meteorology briefing painted a picture that should have grounded all flights, visibility dropping to 2 miles, gusting crosswinds, and the possibility of icing conditions above 8,000 feet. Sandra stood at the operations center window, watching the flag outside snap and twist in the unpredictable air currents. To most pilots, this weather meant a day of frustration, canceled missions, and paperwork. To her, it represented something else entirely. An opportunity. "Hell of a day to be stuck on the ground," Captain Morrison said, joining her at the window. His tone carried the particular irritation of a pilot forced to watch weather instead of flying through it. "Yes, sir," Sandra agreed. "Though the conditions aren't entirely prohibitive." Morrison shot her a sideways glance. "You think? Visibility's dropping fast, and those crosswinds would toss a bird around like a toy." "The winds are consistent with the seasonal pattern," Sandra said, almost absently. "Eastern slopes generate predictable downdrafts this time of year. But if you adjust your approach vector by 15 degrees and compensate for the density-altitude differential." She paused, realizing she was revealing more knowledge than a simple logistics pilot should possess. "Density-altitude differential?" Morrison's voice carried new interest. "That's pretty technical for supply run calculations." Sandra covered smoothly. "I read a lot of meteorology reports. Helps with route planning." But the damage was done. Morrison was looking at her with the sharp attention of someone who'd just heard a recruit quote advanced tactical doctrine. In the background, other conversations continued, but Sandra felt the weight of observation settling on her like crosshairs finding their target. An hour later, the phone rang in the operations center. The duty officer answered, his voice professional but strained. "Sentinel Operations." "Yes, sir." "Understood. We'll check on available assets." He hung up and turned to Commander Torres. "Firebase Charlie needs emergency resupply. They're down to 12 hours of ammunition, and weather's socked in their regular supply route." Torres studied the weather display with the expression of someone being asked to solve an impossible equation. "All flights are grounded. Conditions are too dangerous for anything except emergency medevac." "Sir," the duty officer continued, "Charlie's been taking sporadic fire for 3 days. They can't hold position much longer without resupply." The room fell silent. Firebase Charlie was an isolated position in the northern mountains, a critical observation post that monitored enemy movement through 3 separate valley systems. Losing Charlie would create a blind spot in their intelligence network that could take months to restore. Captain Webb studied the tactical map, his finger tracing the route to Charlie's position. The approach is through Devil's Canyon. Even in good weather, it's a nightmare flight path. In these conditions, he shook his head. Suicide mission. Sandra found herself speaking before she'd consciously decided to. The canyon generates predictable wind patterns. If you approach from the southeast and use the ridge lines for windbreaks, the downdrafts become manageable. Every head in the room turned toward her. Webb's expression shifted from dismissive to actively suspicious. "You've flown Devil's Canyon?" "No, sir." Sandra kept her voice level. "But I've studied the topographical surveys. The wind modeling is pretty straightforward if you account for the thermal differentials." Morrison stepped closer. "Thermal differentials?" Sandra realized she was walking into dangerous territory, but Firebase Charlie's situation was deteriorating by the hour. The eastern face heats faster than the western slopes, creates predictable updrafts between 0900 and 1200 hours. A pilot could use those currents to offset the crosswinds. Webb exchanged a glance with Torres. "You're talking about flying a tactical approach in marginal weather based on meteorological theory." "I'm talking about physics," Sandra replied. "The mountains don't care about our flight schedules. They follow the same patterns every day." The room was completely quiet now. Even the radio operators had turned away from their consoles to listen. What Sandra was describing wasn't textbook knowledge, it was the kind of understanding that came from years of flying in similar conditions, the intuitive grasp of aerodynamics that separated exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. Commander Torres stepped forward. "Keen, you're suggesting this mission is flyable?" Sandra chose her words carefully. "I'm suggesting the weather patterns are more predictable than they appear. Someone with the right experience could probably make it work." "Someone with the right experience." Webb's voice carried a new edge. "What kind of experience would that be?" Before Sandra could answer, the duty officer's phone rang again. This time, his conversation was shorter and more urgent. "Charlie's taking heavy fire. They need immediate resupply, or they'll have to abandon the position." The tactical implications hung in the air like smoke. Losing Firebase Charlie would compromise 3 major intelligence collection efforts and potentially expose Allied positions throughout the northern sector. It was exactly the kind of mission that could change the course of regional operations. Torres made her decision. "Webb, can your team make this run?" Webb studied the weather display again, his confidence visibly wavering. He was an excellent pilot, but 12 years of combat flying had taught him to recognize the difference between acceptable risk and reckless endangerment. "Ma'am, I won't risk my crew on a mission with these margins. The approach to Charlie is technical enough in perfect weather. Add these wind conditions." "I could do it." Sandra's voice cut through the room like a blade. The silence that followed was absolute. Webb stared at her as if she'd just volunteered to fly to the moon. Morrison's jaw actually dropped. Even Torres looked stunned by the quiet certainty in Sandra's voice. "You could do it," Webb repeated, slowly. "You, the supply pilot who's been here for exactly 2 days, think you can fly a mission that I won't attempt?" Sandra met his gaze steadily. "I think I understand the weather patterns better than you're giving me credit for." Webb's laugh held no humor. Understanding weather patterns and flying through Devil's Canyon in a storm are 2 very different things, Keen. "Yes, sir, they are." Sandra's voice remained calm, but Firebase Charlie is running out of time, and someone needs to make the attempt. Torres stepped between them, her command authority reasserting itself. "This conversation is academic. No flights are authorized in these conditions without direct approval from division." But as the meeting broke up and personnel returned to their duties, Sandra caught fragments of whispered conversations. The quiet logistics pilot had just demonstrated knowledge that didn't fit her supposed background. Her casual reference to tactical approaches and thermal modeling had revealed competencies that raised uncomfortable questions about who she really was. That evening, Captain Webb found himself reviewing Sandra's personnel file for the third time. On paper, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a competent but unremarkable logistics specialist with a clean service record and appropriate qualifications. But her comments about Devil's Canyon approach vectors suggested someone who'd studied the terrain with the thoroughness of a combat pilot. In her quarters, Sandra stared at the weather forecast, her mind automatically calculating flight paths and risk factors for a mission that officially couldn't be flown. Outside, the storm was intensifying, and Firebase Charlie was 12 hours away from running dry on ammunition. She touched the photograph of her and JTW, remembering another impossible mission in another war zone when waiting for permission had cost lives she might have saved. The mathematics of the situation were becoming clear. Tomorrow, circumstances would force a choice that would reveal exactly who Lieutenant Commander Sandra Chen really was. The men who dismissed her as just a supply pilot were about to learn that the most dangerous people are often the ones nobody suspects. In the mountains around Sentinel Base, the wind howled through the peaks like a promise of things to come. At 0347 hours, the secure phone in Commander Torres's quarters rang with the shrill urgency that meant lives were already being lost. She answered on the second ring, her voice instantly alert despite being pulled from deep sleep. Torres, yes sir. How many Kia? Understood. What's their ammunition status? The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but when she hung up, the war had changed. Firebase Charlie wasn't just running low on supplies, they were under coordinated assault by a force 3 times larger than intelligence had predicted. The observation post that monitored 3 critical valley systems was about to fall, and with it, the early warning network that protected 12 other Allied positions. By 0400, the operations center buzzed with the controlled chaos of a developing crisis. Officers hunched over communication consoles, their faces painted blue by satellite displays showing Firebase Charlie's desperate situation. The tactical picture was stark. 47 Marines and Special Operations personnel, surrounded by an estimated 200 enemy fighters, with ammunition reserves down to less than 4 hours of sustained combat. Commander Torres stood at the center of it all, her uniform hastily assembled, but her command presence absolute. Status report. What are our options? Captain Webb approached the tactical display, his finger tracing potential flight routes through the mountain passes. Ma'am, the weather hasn't improved. If anything, conditions are worse. Visibility is down to 1 mile, and the winds in Devil's Canyon are gusting to 40 knots. Time to Charlie's position? 43 minutes flight time in these conditions. That's assuming perfect navigation and no combat maneuvering. Torres studied the weather display, her expression grim. Outside, the storm had intensified during the night. What had been marginal flying weather yesterday was now actively dangerous. The kind of conditions that killed experienced pilots who made single mistakes. Major David Kane, the base intelligence officer, approached with a fresh briefing folder. Ma'am, we've got updated enemy positions from the last satellite pass. They're dug in on 3 sides of Charlie's perimeter. The only clear approach is through the canyon, but that route puts any aircraft directly in the path of known anti-aircraft positions. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. Firebase Charlie needed immediate resupply to survive until reinforcements could break through on the ground. But flying to their position required navigating through weather conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots, followed by landing in a hot zone under direct enemy fire. Sir, Webb continued, his voice carrying the weight of years of combat experience, I've flown support missions to Charlie before. The landing zone is tight even in perfect conditions, maybe 50 meters of clear space surrounded by rocky terrain. Add these wind conditions and enemy fire. He shook his head. We'd be flying into a death trap. Torres turned to Morrison, who commanded the base's second gunship team. Rick, what's your assessment? Morrison had been studying the tactical display with the intensity of someone calculating odds he didn't like. Same as Webb, ma'am. The approach vector puts us in a crosswind that'll push any aircraft off the flight path. And Charlie's LZ is basically a postage stamp surrounded by terrain that'll tear rotors off if you get blown sideways. So what are you telling me? That 47 Americans are going to die because the weather's too rough? The question hung in the quote, air like an accusation. These were combat pilots, men who'd built their reputations on flying missions other people couldn't fly. But there was a difference between acceptable risk and certain death, and everyone in the room understood which side of that line this mission fell on. Webb straightened his shoulders. Ma'am, I'll fly anything that has a reasonable chance of success. But this isn't reasonable. It's suicide with extra steps. From the back of the room, a quiet voice cut through the tension. It's not suicide if you understand the terrain. Every head turned. Sandra Keene stood near the communication consoles, her uniform crisp despite the early hour, her expression calm in the face of the crisis developing around her. She'd been monitoring radio traffic, tracking the deteriorating situation at Firebase Charlie with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "Excuse me?" Torres's voice carried surprise and irritation in equal measure. Sandra stepped forward, her movement deliberate but non-threatening. "The approach to Charlie doesn't have to go through Devil's Canyon. There's an alternative route." Webb's expression darkened. "Keene, this isn't the time for theoretical discussions. We're talking about a combat mission, not a training exercise." "I know exactly what we're talking about," Sandra replied, her voice remaining level, "and I know there's another way in." She moved to the tactical display, her finger tracing a path across the digital map that none of the other pilots had considered. The southwestern approach. It adds 12 minutes to the flight time, but it avoids the worst of the canyon winds and provides natural cover from the anti-aircraft positions. Morrison leaned closer, studying the route she'd indicated. "That path goes through the Khyber Ridge system. Those peaks are over 10,000 feet. No way to maintain altitude in these weather conditions." "You don't maintain altitude," Sandra said simply. "You use the valleys. Follow the riverbeds, use the terrain for windbreaks, and approach Charlie from the south, where their defensive positions provide natural cover for the landing zone." The room fell silent. What Sandra was describing wasn't standard flight doctrine. It was nap of the earth flying, a specialized technique used by pilots trained for deep reconnaissance missions in hostile territory. The kind of flying that required split-second timing, perfect terrain awareness, and nerves that didn't break under pressure. Major Kane studied the route more carefully. The southern approach would put an aircraft below the enemy's primary observation points. They'd have minimal time to react before a bird was on the ground. If the pilot could navigate through those valleys without GPS, Webb countered, the terrain would block satellite signals. You'd be flying blind. Sandra's hand moved unconsciously to touch something beneath her flight suit, a gesture so brief that only Spidio flight someone trained in observation would notice it. Dead reckoning navigation isn't that difficult if you know the landmarks. Dead reckoning? Morrison's voice carried new sharpness. That's Vietnam-era pilot training. They don't even teach those techniques anymore. Some of us read the old manuals, Sandra replied, but her tone had shifted slightly. She was walking into dangerous territory, revealing knowledge that didn't fit her supposed background as a simple logistics pilot. Torres stepped between the growing confrontation. "Keene, you're suggesting this mission is flyable using techniques that haven't been standard doctrine for 20 years. I'm suggesting the mission is flyable, period." Sandra met the commander's gaze directly. "Firebase Charlie has 47 people who are going to die unless someone makes the attempt. And you think you're that someone?" Webb's voice dripped skepticism. Sandra paused, the weight of the moment settling on her like gravity. In her mind, she could hear JTW's voice from 2 years ago, warning her about the cost of hesitation. She could see Firebase Charlie's position on the tactical display, could imagine the faces of the Marines holding their defensive perimeter as ammunition ran low and hope faded. "I think I'm the only pilot in this room who studied that terrain extensively enough to navigate it in these conditions," she said quietly. The admission hung in the air like a dropped bomb. Webb stared at her, as if she'd just claimed the ability to fly backwards. Morrison's jaw clenched with the particular anger of someone who'd just been professionally insulted by a subordinate. But Torres was studying Sandra with new attention, seeing something in her expression that hadn't been there during the routine briefings and casual conversations of the past few days. Keen. What aren't you telling us? Before Sandra could answer, the secure phone rang again. Torres answered, her conversation brief and increasingly urgent. When she hung up, her face was pale. Charlie's ammunition is down to 2 hours. They're taking casualties, and the enemy is massing for a final assault. She turned to face the assembled pilots. If we're going to do something, it has to be now. Sandra felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down, the way moments of decision seemed to stretch when lives hung in the balance. She thought about the men at Firebase Charlie, about JTW, about all the missions where hesitation had cost more than action ever could. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying a new authority that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her supposed rank. "Give me clearance, and I'll bring them their ammunition." Webb stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. "Commander, I strongly advise against authorizing Lieutenant Commander Keen for this mission. She doesn't have the experience for—" "What experience would that be, Captain?" Sandra's interruption was soft, but it cut through Webb's protest like a knife. "How many nap of the Earth penetration missions have you flown? How many times have you navigated mountain terrain without GPS? How many landings have you made in hot zones under direct enemy fire?" The questions came in rapid succession, each one revealing knowledge that a logistics pilot shouldn't possess. Webb's face flushed with anger and confusion, but he couldn't answer because the honest truth was that his combat experience, extensive as it was, hadn't included the specialized techniques Sandra was describing. Torres raised her hand, cutting off whatever response Webb was preparing. "Keen, if I authorize this mission, can you guarantee success?" Sandra met her gaze steadily. "No, ma'am. I can guarantee that I'll get to Firebase Charlie or die trying. The men at Charlie deserve someone who won't give up on them." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady hum of radio traffic and the whisper of wind against the operations center windows. Torres studied Sandra for a long moment, seeing past the quiet exterior to something harder underneath. "Prep your bird," Torres said finally. "You have authorization for immediate departure." Webb started to protest, but Torres cut him off with a look. "Captain, Lieutenant Commander Keen has volunteered for a mission that needs to be flown. Unless you're volunteering to take her place, I suggest you help her prepare." As Sandra headed for the door, her steps already quickening toward the flight line, she heard Morrison's voice behind her. "Jesus Christ, who is she?" It was a question that would be answered in the next 43 minutes, as the quiet logistics pilot demonstrated exactly why some secrets are kept classified and why the most dangerous people are often the ones nobody expects. Hawk 11 sat on the tarmac like a sleeping predator, its rotor blades drooping in the pre-dawn darkness. Sandra approached her aircraft with the measured pace of someone who'd done this countless times before, but Sergeant Cole and his maintenance crew watched her with the sharp attention of professionals who'd just witnessed something that didn't add up. "Ma'am," Cole said, falling into step beside her, "I've got her fueled and armed per your request, but I have to say, nobody's flown a combat load in weather like this since I've been at Sentinel." Sandra ran her hand along the helicopter's fuselage, feeling for the subtle vibrations that would indicate potential mechanical issues. Her touch was practiced, unconscious, the gesture of someone who knew aircraft the way other people knew their own heartbeat. "How's the tail rotor balance?" she asked, her fingers probing a section of the aircraft that most pilots never bothered to inspect personally. Cole blinked. Perfect, ma'am. Had her rebalanced last week after that hard landing Morrison made. But how did you know to check that specific fuel pump pressure? Nominal across all systems. Ma'am, can I ask where you learned to? Sandra was already moving, climbing into the cockpit with fluid efficiency. Her pre-flight check began immediately. hands dancing across controls, with the kind of muscle memory that came from thousands of hours in similar aircraft. But it wasn't just familiarity. It was the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to find problems that could kill you at 10,000 feet. From the maintenance bay, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos watched the display with growing confusion. "Cole," she said quietly, "that's not how logistics pilots do pre-flight." Cole nodded, his expression troubled. "That's combat pilot procedure. Full systems check, redundancy, verification." He paused, studying Sandra's movements. She just tested the emergency hydraulic backup. Why would a supply pilot even know about that system? Inside the cockpit, Sandra's hands moved with practiced precision through checks that Webb and Morrison would have recognized as special operations standard, the kind of thorough preparation that assumed you might need every backup system just to survive the mission. She tested communication frequencies that weren't on standard logistics channels, verified navigation equipment that supply pilots rarely used, and loaded tactical approach data that shouldn't have been available to someone with her supposed clearance level. "Hawk 11, this is Control Tower." The voice in her headset belonged to Captain Torres, no relation to the base commander, who'd been assigned as flight coordinator for the mission. "You're cleared for engine start, but I need to confirm your approach vector." Sandra keyed her microphone, her voice calm despite the chaos building around Firebase Charlie. "Control, I'll be taking the southwestern approach through the valley systems. Flight time approximately 55 minutes. There was a pause. "Hawk 11, that route isn't in any of our standard flight plans." "Copy that, Control. I'll be navigating by terrain reference." Another, longer, pause. In the background, Sandra could hear urgent conversations as tower personnel tried to understand how a pilot could navigate mountain terrain in storm conditions without following established routes. Captain Morrison's voice cut into the communication. "Keen, what terrain references? Half those valleys don't even have proper mapping." Sandra's response was immediate, automatic, revealing knowledge she'd tried to keep hidden. "Grid reference 47 Alpha through 52 Charlie, following the Khyber Riverbed system to waypoint Bravo 7, then terrain following approach through the Southern Pass system. Standard infiltration route 4. She caught herself, but the damage was done. Morrison's voice sharpened. "Standard infiltration route 4. What, Keen?" "For aircraft operating in similar terrain," Sandra finished, but her cover was unraveling with each word she spoke. The engine spooled up with increasing intensity, the familiar whine of turbines building toward operational power. Sandra felt the aircraft come alive beneath her, systems integrating into the complex harmony of controlled flight. But around the flight line, personnel were beginning to notice discrepancies that raised uncomfortable questions about who she really was. Sergeant First Class Rick Hawkins jogged toward the aircraft, carrying additional ammunition loads that hadn't been on the original manifest. "Ma'am," he called over the engine noise. "Special Operations requested we add these smoke grenades and emergency medical supplies to your cargo." Sandra nodded, but Hawkins noticed something that made him pause. Stenciled on the ammunition crates were markings that indicated Special Operations standard loads, specialized munitions that weren't typically carried on logistics flights. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "these are so specific loads. You familiar with the deployment procedures? Stack them behind the crew chief position, secure with double tie-downs, and verify the center of gravity. Shift doesn't exceed operational parameters." Sandra replied without thinking. Hawkins stared at her. Those procedures were classified at the secret level, available only to personnel with specific operational clearances. A simple logistics pilot shouldn't know about weight distribution requirements for special operations ammunition. As the rotor blades began their lazy rotation, building speed toward flight RPM, more personnel gathered to watch the departure. Word had spread through the base that the quiet supply pilot was attempting a mission that the gunship crews had declared impossible. Some came out of curiosity, others from professional interest, but all of them sensed they were witnessing something unusual. Master Sergeant Tom Bradley, the senior enlisted advisor for flight operations, approached Cole with a puzzled expression. That bird's carrying a full combat load. Anti-armor missiles, door guns, countermeasure dispensers. When did we start arming supply helicopters like gunships? Cole shook his head. She requested the armament. Said Firebase Charlie might need close air support during the extraction. Close air support? Bradley's voice climbed. Supply pilots don't provide CAS. They don't have the training for. His words were cut off as Sandra's voice came over the flight line communication system, clear and professional despite the increasing rotor noise. Tower, Hawk 11 requesting permission to lift off. I have Firebase Charlie on emergency frequency, and their situation is deteriorating rapidly. You have Charlie on emergency frequency? Morrison's voice carried new urgency. Those are encrypted channels. How did you permission to lift off? Sandra repeated, ignoring the question. Torres's voice cut through the confusion. Hawk 11, you are cleared for immediate departure. Godspeed. As the helicopter lifted from the tarmac, dust and debris swirling in the rotor wash, the assembled personnel stood in silence. What they'd just witnessed didn't match their understanding of who Sandra Chen was supposed to be. The systematic pre-flight checks, the knowledge of special operations procedures, the casual reference to classified navigation routes, none of it fit with her personnel file. Sergeant Santos voiced what everyone was thinking. Cole, that's not a logistics pilot. Cole was studying the departure path Sandra had taken, watching her aircraft disappear into the storm clouds with the kind of confidence that came from absolute mastery of the machine. No, he said slowly. It's not. Inside the operations center, Major Kane was pulling up Sandra's service record on his computer, cross-referencing her supposed assignments with the capabilities she'd just demonstrated. What he found didn't add up. Her official record showed standard logistics training, routine transport missions, and competency evaluations that were good but not exceptional. But the pilot who'd just taken off into impossible weather conditions had displayed knowledge that suggested entirely different training and experience. Commander, Kane said, approaching Torres with his printouts, I think we need to talk about Lieutenant Commander Keen's background. Torres looked up from the tactical display, where she was tracking Sandra's progress toward Firebase Charlie. What about it? Her service record doesn't match what we just saw. The navigation techniques she mentioned, the equipment procedures she knew, the communication protocols she used, that's not logistics training. Torres studied the documents Kane had prepared, her expression growing more serious with each page. What are you thinking, Major? I'm thinking we don't know who we just sent to Firebase Charlie, Kane replied. And I'm thinking that might be exactly what those Marines need. On the tactical display, a single green blip moved steadily through the mountain terrain, following a route that didn't appear on any standard navigation chart. Sandra Chen was flying into the storm, carrying secrets that were about to be revealed by the crucible of combat. Behind her, the personnel at Sentinel Base were beginning to understand that they'd been working alongside someone whose true identity was far more significant than anyone had suspected. The quiet logistics pilot was gone, replaced by someone whose real capabilities were about to be tested in the most dangerous mountains in Afghanistan. Firebase Charlie crouched on the mountainside like a wounded animal, its defensive perimeter shrinking under relentless enemy fire. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez pressed his back against the sandbagged wall of the communications bunker, his radio crackling with the desperate voices of Marines fighting for their lives. Control, this is Charlie 6. He called into his handset, trying to project calm he didn't feel. Ammunition status critical. We've got wounded who need immediate medevac. How long until resupply? The response came through static and interference. Charlie 6. Hawk 11 is inbound your location. ETA 12 minutes. Rodriguez exchanged glances with Corporal Williams, his radio operator. 12 minutes might as well have been 12 hours. Enemy forces were massing for what looked like a final assault, and Charlie's defenders were down to their last few magazines of ammunition. Hawk 11? Williams asked. That's not one of the usual gunship call signs. Before Rodriguez could answer, the distinctive whip crack of incoming sniper fire sent both men diving for cover. Concrete chips exploded from the bunker wall above their heads, and somewhere in the perimeter, a Marine screamed for a medic. 10 miles away, Sandra fought her way through weather that would have challenged pilots with twice her supposed experience. The storm had intensified during her flight, turning the mountain valleys into a maze of wind shear and zero visibility. Ice formed on her rotor blades despite the heating elements, and turbulence threw the bitter-covered aircraft around like a toy. But she flew through it all with the calm precision of someone who'd navigated worse conditions in places that didn't officially exist. Her hands on the controls were steady, making constant micro-corrections that kept the helicopter stable despite the chaos outside. The navigation display showed blank terrain, but Sandra flew by memory and instinct, following landmarks that existed more in her mental map than on any chart. Charlie 6. This is Hawk 11. She called over the emergency frequency. I'm 5 minutes out from your position. What's your defensive status? Rodriguez's voice came back strained but professional. Hawk 11. We've got enemy forces on 3 sides, approximately 200 meters from our perimeter. Landing zone is under intermittent fire, and we've got wounded who need immediate evacuation. Copy that, Charlie 6. I'm carrying medical supplies and ammunition. Can you mark your LZ? Roger, Hawk 11. Popping smoke now. Through her rain-streaked windscreen, Sandra caught a glimpse of orange smoke rising from what looked like impossible terrain, a narrow patch of rocky ground surrounded by steep cliffs and defensive positions. The landing zone was exactly as advertised, barely large enough for a helicopter and completely exposed to enemy observation. But it wasn't the LZ that made her pause. It was the radio call sign she'd just heard. Charlie 6. Confirm your actual name, she said, her voice carrying new intensity. Hawk 11, this is Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, acting commander of Firebase Charlie. Sandra's breath caught. Rodriguez. She'd known a Rodriguez once, in another war zone, during operations that were still classified at the highest levels. A young sergeant who'd been part of a special operations unit that officially didn't exist. Rodriguez, she said carefully. Were you ever assigned to Task Force Black? The silence that followed lasted long enough for Sandra to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. Task Force Black was so far beyond classified that acknowledging its existence was a career-ending offense. But she had to know. Jesus Christ. Rodriguez's voice came back, filled with disbelief. Viper? Is that you? The call sign hit Sandra like a physical blow. Viper, the name she'd carried during 18 months of deep reconnaissance missions in 3 different countries. The identity she'd supposedly left behind when Task Force Black was officially disbanded and its personnel scattered to routine assignments throughout the military. Confirm your identity. Charlie 6, she said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, formerly of Task Force Black, 3rd Squadron. Viper, how the hell are you flying supply missions? Sandra banked her aircraft into the final approach, the landing zone growing larger through the storm. Around Firebase Charlie's perimeter, she could see muzzle flashes and the organized chaos of a defensive action. Marines moved between positions with the disciplined efficiency of professionals who knew their business, but their ammunition situation was clearly desperate. Long story, Rodriguez. Right now, let's focus on keeping you alive. She dropped toward the LZ with the aggressive approach of someone who'd made similar landings under fire. The aircraft bucked and fought against the wind, but Sandra held it steady through pure force of will and years of training that didn't appear in her official service record. As the skids touched down, enemy fire immediately shifted toward the helicopter. Rounds sparked off the armor plating, and spiderweb cracks appeared in the windscreen. Sandra kept the engines spooled up, ready for immediate departure. Charlie 6, I'm on the ground. Get your wounded loaded first. What happened next would be talked about at Sentinel Base for years. Marines who'd been fighting for their lives suddenly moved with new energy, seeing salvation in the person form of a helicopter that had appeared out of impossible weather. Wounded were carried aboard with careful efficiency while Sandra provided covering fire from the door gun, a weapon she operated with the kind of expertise that came from extensive combat experience. But it was Rodriguez who provided the real revelation. As he supervised the loading of ammunition crates, he keyed his radio on an open frequency that could be monitored back at Sentinel Base. All stations, be advised that Hawk 11 is being flown by callsign Viper, formerly assigned to classified special operations. This pilot has conducted deep reconnaissance missions in denied territory and has never failed to complete an assigned mission. The words carried across multiple communication networks, reaching not just Firebase Charlie but every listening post in the region. At Sentinel Base, Captain Webb heard them and felt his understanding of the world shift fundamentally. Major Kane grabbed Torres's arm. "Commander, Rodriguez just said Viper. That call sign is in the database, but the file is classified at levels I don't have access to." Torres was staring at the communication display as reports flowed in from Firebase Charlie. The quiet logistics pilot was not only extracting wounded under fire, but providing close air support with the kind of precision that suggested extensive combat training. "Who is she?" Torres whispered. Before anyone could answer, Sandra's voice came over the tactical frequency, calm and professional despite the chaos around her. "Charlie, 6, all wounded are aboard. I'm providing suppressive fire for your withdrawal to secondary positions." What followed was a textbook demonstration of close air support tactics. Sandra maneuvered her helicopter with lethal precision, using the aircraft's weapons systems to break up enemy formations and create corridors for Charlie's defenders to reposition. Her targeting was surgical, her communication with ground forces seamless, her tactical awareness absolute. Captain Morrison, listening to the radio traffic, turned to Webb with an expression of stunned disbelief. "She's not just providing CAS, she's coordinating a tactical withdrawal. That's advanced squadron leader training." Webb was studying the tactical display, watching Sandra's aircraft dance through enemy fire while simultaneously managing multiple communication frequencies and coordinating with ground forces. What he was seeing represented years of specialized training and combat experience that no logistics pilot should possess. "Control." Sandra's voice cut through the radio traffic. "Charlie 6 is withdrawing to defensible positions. I'm carrying 5 wounded and need immediate clearance to the nearest medical facility." Torres keyed her microphone. "Hawk 11, you're cleared direct to Bagram Air Base. Medical teams are standing by." "Negative, Control. I'm returning to Sentinel. These Marines aren't leaving without their ammunition." The audacity of the statement left the operations center speechless. Sandra was declaring her intention to return to Firebase Charlie to fly back into the kill zone she'd just escaped because the mission wasn't complete. Rodriguez's voice confirmed what everyone feared. "Hawk 11, we still need those ammunition resupplies. Can you make another run?" Sandra's answer came without hesitation. "Charlie 6, I'll be back in 40 minutes. Hold your positions." As Hawk 11 disappeared into the storm, carrying wounded Marines toward safety, the personnel at Sentinel Base tried to process what they'd just witnessed. The quiet logistics pilot had just executed one of the most difficult combat missions any of them had ever seen, displaying capabilities that raised fundamental questions about who she really was. Major Kane was already on the secure phone, calling contacts at higher headquarters who might have access to Sandra's real service record. What he found would change everything the base thought they knew about Lieutenant Commander Sandra Keene. But for now, all they could do was wait and prepare for her return, knowing that the most dangerous pilot any of them had ever served with was about to attempt an even more impossible mission. The truth about Viper was about to be revealed, and it would transform not just their understanding of Sandra Keene, but their comprehension of what courage really meant when everything was on the line. The flight back to Sentinel Base took 47 minutes through weather that had worsened from dangerous to deadly. Sandra fought Hawk 11 through wind shear that would have torn lesser pilots from the sky. ice accumulation that threatened rotor blade integrity, and visibility so poor she was navigating by instruments and instinct alone. But she'd promised Rodriguez 40 minutes, and every second beyond that deadline meant Marines at Firebase Charlie were burning through ammunition they couldn't spare. The wounded strapped into her cargo bay had fallen silent during the flight, their pain medication taking effect as medics worked to stabilize injuries that ranged from shrapnel wounds to a sucking chest wound that had required emergency surgery in the back of a helicopter flying through a mountain storm. Sandra could hear their labored breathing through her headset, a reminder that her mission had meaning beyond tactical objectives. As Sentinel Base appeared through the storm clouds, Sandra keyed her radio for landing clearance. Sentinel Tower. Hawk 11 requesting immediate medical evacuation landing. I have 5 wounded aboard, 2 critical. Roger, Hawk 11. Medical teams are standing by. You're cleared for direct approach to the medical pad. But Sandra wasn't looking at the medical facility. Her eyes were fixed on the ammunition depot, where ground crews would need to load another full combat resupply for her return flight to Charlie. The mathematics were unforgiving. With the deteriorating weather, she had perhaps one more flight window before conditions became absolutely impossible. As Hawk 11 settled onto the medical pad, rotor wash scattering debris across the tarmac, Sandra found herself surrounded by more personnel than she'd expected. Word of her mission had spread through the base with the speed that military gossip always achieved, but this felt different. The faces watching her weren't showing the casual curiosity she'd grown accustomed to. They were displaying something that looked uncomfortably like respect. Medics rushed forward as she shut down the engines, their movements practiced and efficient as they transferred the wounded from her cargo bay to waiting stretchers. Sandra climbed down from the cockpit, her legs slightly unsteady after nearly 2 hours of flying through conditions that had demanded every ounce of her concentration. "Ma'am." The voice belonged to Hospital Corpsman First Class, Jennifer Martinez, the senior medic supervising the casualty evacuation. "The wounded Marine you brought in, Lance Corporal Thompson. He wanted me to give you something." Martinez held out a small object that Sandra recognized immediately, a combat medic badge, the kind earned through months of training and validated by saving lives under fire. It was Thompson's personal badge, worn and faded from years of service. "He said to tell you," Martinez continued, "Viper saved my life twice today, once by getting me out of Charlie, and once by coming back for the others." Sandra stared at the badge, its metal surface catching the reflection of the medical pad floodlights. She'd never worn a medic badge, her training had been in different specialties, but she understood the significance of Thompson's gesture. In the Brotherhood of Combat Veterans, sharing your qualification badges was reserved for those who'd proven themselves worthy of the highest respect. "Tell Lance Corporal Thompson, I'll return this when he's back on his feet," Sandra said, pocketing the badge. "And tell him Charlie's Marines aren't finished fighting yet." As the medical teams rushed the wounded toward the base hospital, Sandra turned toward the ammunition depot where Sergeant Cole and his crew were already preparing another resupply load. But she found her path blocked by an unexpected gathering of personnel who seemed to have materialized from across the base. At the front of the group stood Master Sergeant Bradley, the senior enlisted advisor she'd barely spoken to since her arrival. Behind him were mechanics, radio operators, administrative personnel, and junior officers who'd somehow found reasons to be on the flight line despite the late hour and dangerous weather. Bradley stepped forward, his expression serious but not hostile. "Ma'am, word came down about what you did at Firebase Charlie, about who you really are." Sandra felt the familiar weight of exposure, the vulnerability that came when carefully maintained covers were blown. "Sergeant, I'm just doing my job." "No, ma'am." Bradley's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd served long enough to recognize the difference between routine competence and exceptional courage. "What you did today, that wasn't logistics, that wasn't supply runs, that was combat aviation at the highest level." Around him, other personnel nodded in agreement. Sandra could see it in their faces, the shift from polite tolerance to genuine respect that came when people realized they'd been in the presence of someone whose reputation extended far beyond their current assignment. "Ma'am," a young airman called from the back of the group, "is it true you were Task Force Black?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge. Task Force Black's existence was classified at levels that most of these personnel would never access. Acknowledging her connection to the unit would violate security protocols that had governed her entire military career. But Firebase Charlie was still under siege, and Rodriguez was counting on her return. The time for maintaining operational security had passed when she'd keyed her radio and accepted the call sign that defined her real identity. Task Force Black was disbanded 2 years ago, Sandra said carefully. Its personnel were reassigned throughout the military to maintain operational security. The non-answer was answer enough. Bradley nodded slowly, understanding the constraints that prevented her from speaking more directly about classified operations. "Ma'am," he said, raising his right hand to his brow in a crisp salute. "It's an honor to serve with you." The salute rippled through the assembled personnel like a wave. One by one, from senior NCOs to junior enlisted, hands rose in recognition of someone whose true worth had been revealed by crisis. Sandra found herself facing a sea of salutes from people who dismissed her as an unremarkable logistics pilot just hours earlier. She returned the salute with military precision, but her voice carried the strain of emotions she'd kept carefully controlled. "Thank you, all of you. But Charlie's still fighting, and they need ammunition more than they need ceremony." As the group began to disperse, Sandra heard fragments of conversation that would have been impossible to imagine that morning. "Viper. Jesus Christ, no wonder she knew those navigation routes. Task Force Black. I heard they operated in places that don't even have names. 18 months of deep reconnaissance. How many pilots can claim that kind of experience?" But the voice that stopped her belonged to Captain Morrison, who'd approached while she was focused on the crowd. His expression carried the particular discomfort of someone forced to reevaluate assumptions he'd held with absolute confidence. "Keen," he said, his voice lacking its usual easy authority. "I owe you an apology." Sandra turned to face him, seeing past the pilot's swagger to something more honest underneath. "No, you don't, Captain. You had no reason to believe I was anything other than what my orders claimed." "Maybe not," Morrison replied. "But I had no reason to assume you couldn't handle advanced flying either. I let my ego do the thinking instead of my brain." It was as close to an admission of error as Sandra had ever heard from a combat pilot of Morrison's experience. She could see the cost of the acknowledgement in his expression, the recognition that his prejudices had nearly prevented a successful mission. "The mission isn't over yet," Sandra said. "Charlie needs another resupply run, and the weather's getting worse. I could use a wingman for the return flight." Morrison's surprise was evident. After everything that had happened, the dismissiveness, the condescension, the assumption that she couldn't handle real missions, she was offering to let him participate in the most dangerous flight either of them would ever attempt. "You'd trust me as your wingman?" Sandra's smile carried just a hint of the confidence that had made Viper a legend in classified circles. "Captain, you're an excellent pilot who made the mistake of thinking logistics training means limited ability. But I've seen your flight records, and when lives are on the line, I want excellent pilots beside me." As Morrison hurried toward his own aircraft to begin pre-flight preparations, Sandra felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Sergeant Cole, his expression mixing professional respect with personal admiration. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "the crew's been talking about what you did today, about who you really are. I want you to know we've never been prouder to serve with anyone." The simple statement carried more weight than any formal recognition could have provided. These were the people who kept aircraft flying, who worked 18-hour days to ensure that missions succeeded and personnel came home safely. Their respect wasn't given lightly or withdrawn easily. "Sergeant," Sandra replied, "the pride should go to the Marines at Firebase Charlie, who've been holding their position against impossible odds. We're just the delivery service." But as she walked toward the ammunition depot to supervise the loading of her second combat resupply, Sandra knew that something fundamental had changed. The careful anonymity she'd maintained for 2 years was gone, replaced by recognition that brought both opportunity and responsibility. The personnel at Sentinel Base now knew they were serving alongside someone whose reputation extended far beyond routine assignments. And in a few hours, when she returned from Firebase Charlie with the last of the wounded and confirmation that the mission was complete, that recognition would become something more permanent. For now, though, Rodriguez and his Marines were still fighting, and the clock was running out on their ammunition. Sandra quickened her pace toward the waiting helicopter, leaving the gathering crowd behind as she focused on the mission that would define not just her cover identity, but her true worth as both a pilot and a soldier. Captain Webb stood alone in the operations center, staring at the tactical display that showed 2 aircraft preparing for departure into weather conditions he'd declared unsurvivable just hours earlier. The green blip, representing Hawk 11, pulsed steadily on the screen, accompanied now by a second signal indicating Morrison's gunship moving into formation. The irony wasn't lost on him. The pilot he'd dismissed as incompetent was leading a mission he'd refused to attempt, accompanied by his own wingman, who'd apparently found enough confidence in her abilities to risk his life following her into the storm. "Sir?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Sarah Chen, the junior communications officer who'd been monitoring radio traffic from Firebase Charlie. "We're receiving confirmation that the first ammunition resupply was successful. Charlie's defensive perimeter is stabilized, and they're preparing for the second delivery." Webb nodded absently, his attention fixed on intelligence reports that painted an increasingly clear picture of what Sandra Keene had accomplished during her first flight. The tactical analysis was stark. She'd flown through weather conditions that grounded every other aircraft on the base, navigated terrain that required specialized training to survive, and executed a combat mission with precision that suggested years of experience in similar operations. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "pull up everything we have on Task Force Black." Chen's fingers moved across her keyboard, accessing databases that required security clearances Webb wasn't entirely certain he possessed. What appeared on the screen made him understand exactly how wrong his assessment of Sandra had been. Task Force Black had been a joint special operations unit tasked with deep reconnaissance missions in denied territory. Its personnel were drawn from the most elite aviation units across all service branches, selected for their ability to operate independently in hostile environments where conventional support wasn't available. The unit's mission record was heavily classified. But what Webb could see suggested operations that redefined the boundaries of possible. 18-month deployments in countries that didn't officially host American forces. Navigation through terrain that existed more in satellite photographs than actual maps. Combat missions where failure meant not just operational defeat, but international incidents that could destabilize entire regions. "Jesus," Webb whispered, scanning through redacted mission summaries that hinted at the scope of Task Force Black's operations. She really was part of this. Chen looked up from her console, her expression troubled. "Sir, there's something else. I've been monitoring communications from higher headquarters. Word about today's mission has reached division level, and they're asking very specific questions about Lieutenant Commander Keene's current assignment." Webb felt his stomach clench. Division-level interest meant that Sandra's cover was blown beyond any hope of restoration. Whatever operational security had brought her to Sentinel Base under a false identity was about to be compromised by the very success that had revealed her true capabilities. What kind of questions? They want to know why a pilot with her background was assigned to logistics duties. They want a complete mission debrief. And sir, Chen hesitated, they want to know why you initially refused to authorize the Firebase Charlie mission. The words hit Webb like a physical blow. His decision to ground all flights in marginal weather had been tactically sound, based on years of experience and established safety protocols. But it had also condemned 47 Americans to death, and only Sandra's willingness to disobey orders had prevented a catastrophe that would have haunted everyone involved. "Pull my mission logs," Webb said, his voice hollow. "Everything from the last 72 hours. If Division wants answers, They're going to get them. But even as Chen began compiling the requested information, Webb knew that the real judgment wouldn't come from higher headquarters. It would come from his own understanding of what had happened, and what it revealed about his capabilities as both a pilot and a leader. The secure phone rang, its harsh tone cutting through the ambient noise of the operations center. Webb answered on the second ring, recognizing the voice of Colonel Marcus Thompson, the division aviation commander he'd served under for 3 years. "Captain Webb, I need an immediate explanation for why one of my most experienced pilot commanders refused a rescue mission that was successfully completed by a supposed logistics specialist." The conversation that followed was the most difficult of Webb's military career. He found himself explaining decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time, but appeared catastrophically wrong in hindsight. He defended judgment calls that had prioritized safety over mission accomplishment, and acknowledged tactical assessments that had been proven false by someone with better training and greater experience. "Sir," Webb said finally, "I made the best decision I could with the information available. The weather conditions were beyond the parameters we normally consider acceptable for flight operations." "Captain," Colonel Thompson's voice carried the particular coldness reserved for subordinates who'd failed to meet standards. "Lieutenant Commander Keene flew through those same conditions not once, but twice. She extracted wounded personnel, resupplied a critical defensive position, and coordinated close air support, all while navigating terrain that requires specialized training most pilots don't possess." Webb closed his eyes, seeing the tactical display that showed Sandra's continued progress toward Firebase Charlie. "Yes, sir. She did. The question I need," answered Captain, "is why you didn't recognize her capabilities when she volunteered for the mission." It was the question Webb had been asking himself since Sandra's aircraft had disappeared into the storm. The answer was uncomfortable but undeniable. He'd allowed his preconceptions about logistics pilots to override his judgment about individual capability. He'd seen the assignment rather than the person, the supposed limitations rather than the actual qualifications. "Sir," he said, forcing himself to be completely honest, "I assumed that logistics assignment meant limited combat experience. I was wrong." "You were wrong," Thompson agreed. "And your error in judgment nearly cost 47 American lives. The only reason this conversation isn't happening in the context of a court-martial is that Lieutenant Commander Keene chose to ignore your assessment and complete the mission anyway." Webb stared at the tactical display, watching the green blips that represented Sandra and Morrison approaching Firebase Charlie for the final ammunition delivery. In a few hours, they would return with confirmation that the mission was complete and all personnel had been successfully evacuated. What should have been a moment of celebration would instead be a reminder of his failure to recognize excellence when it stood directly in front of him. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what are my orders?" "Your orders, Captain, are to complete a full mission debrief that explains exactly how this situation developed. You will document your decision-making process, your assessment of Lieutenant Commander Keene's capabilities, and your recommendations for preventing similar errors in the future." Thompson paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a weight that spoke to years of experience in operations where small mistakes had large consequences. "Captain Webb, you're an excellent pilot with a distinguished service record, but today you let your assumptions override your judgment, and it nearly had catastrophic results. Use this experience to become a better officer, because the military can't afford leaders who can't recognize excellence, regardless of where they find it." As the call ended, Webb found himself alone with the recognition that his career would be forever marked by this day. Not because he'd failed in combat or made errors under fire, but because he'd been unable to see past his own prejudices when lives hung in the balance. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and 2 aircraft fought their way through impossible weather toward a mission that would save 47 Americans. One of those aircraft was flown by the pilot he'd dismissed as incompetent. The other was flown by his own wingman, who'd found enough faith in her abilities to risk everything on her judgment. The lesson was clear. and Webb would carry it for the rest of his military career. True leadership meant recognizing excellence wherever it appeared, not just where you expected to find it. And sometimes, the most dangerous mistake a leader could make was underestimating the quiet professionals who did their jobs without seeking recognition or approval. When Sandra returned from Firebase Charlie, Webb would be waiting, not to offer excuses or deflect responsibility, but to acknowledge his error and learn from someone whose competence he should have recognized from the beginning. In the mountains of Afghanistan, courage was proving itself once again, and back at Sentinel Base, a senior officer was discovering that wisdom sometimes came from recognizing how much he still had to learn. Dawn broke over the Hindu Kush Mountains with the kind of crystalline clarity that only followed the worst storms. The wind that had howled through the passes for 18 hours had finally died, leaving behind air so still it seemed to hold its breath. Across the peaks, clouds clung to the highest ridges like battle flags, marking the boundaries of a war that was finally ending. At Sentinel Base, the flight line buzzed with activity that felt different from the routine chaos of normal operations. Personnel moved with the focused energy of people who'd witnessed something extraordinary, and conversations carried an undercurrent of excitement that suggested word of the Firebase Charlie mission had reached every corner of the facility. Sandra walked across the tarmac toward the operations center, her flight suit still damp with sweat despite the morning chill. The second resupply mission to Charlie had taken 4 hours through weather that had pushed both aircraft beyond their design limits, but Rodriguez and his Marines now had enough ammunition to hold their position until ground reinforcements arrived the following day. Behind her, Hawk 11 sat silent on the flight line, its rotor blades drooping in the still air. The helicopter bore the scars of 2 combat missions: bullet holes in the fuselage, spider web cracks in the windscreen, and sensor equipment that would need complete replacement. But it had brought everyone home, and in Sandra's mind, that made it the most beautiful aircraft she'd ever flown. "Ma'am." The voice belonged to Sergeant Cole, who jogged up beside her with a maintenance clipboard in his hand. "I've completed the post-flight inspection. She's going to need some work, but the structural integrity is sound. You flew the hell out of her." Sandra paused, looking back at the helicopter that had carried her through 18 months of classified operations before becoming her salvation during the most important mission of her career. "Take good care of her, Sergeant. She's earned some attention." As they approached the operations center, Sandra noticed an unusual gathering of vehicles near the main entrance: staff cars, communication trucks, and the kind of official transportation that suggested the arrival of personnel whose rank extended far beyond base level. The Firebase Charlie mission had apparently attracted attention from higher headquarters. Inside, the operations center hummed with controlled activity. Additional communication equipment had been installed overnight, and the tactical displays showed expanded coverage of the entire regional operational area. What had begun as a routine forward operating base was being transformed into something more significant. Commander Torres approached, her expression mixing relief with official concern. "Keen, I need to debrief you on both missions before the division personnel arrive. They have some very specific questions about your background and current assignment." "Yes, ma'am." Sandra had expected this conversation since the moment Rodriguez had used her call sign over open frequencies. The operational security that had protected her cover for 2 years was gone, burned away by the necessity of saving lives when conventional approaches had failed. But before Torres could begin the formal debriefing, the operations center door opened to admit a group of senior officers whose rank insignia indicated involvement at levels far above routine base operations. Leading them was a Colonel Sandra recognized from classified briefings she'd attended during her Task Force Black assignment. Colonel Robert Hayes paused when he saw her, his expression shifting from official business to something approaching personal warmth. "Lieutenant Commander Keene, or should I say, Viper?" The use of her operational call sign in an open facility sent ripples of recognition through the assembled personnel. Sandra came to attention, but Hayes waved her to a more relaxed posture. "Colonel?" Sandra said simply. I wasn't expecting to see you here. When word reached my office that Viper had surfaced during a combat mission in Afghanistan, I thought it warranted personal attention." Hayes gestured toward the tactical displays that still showed the Firebase Charlie area of operations, especially when the mission reports suggested capabilities that officially don't exist in a logistics pilot's training record. Torres stepped forward, her command authority asserting itself despite the presence of senior officers. "Sir, Lieutenant Commander Keene completed both Firebase Charlie missions with exceptional skill and courage. Whatever her background, she saved 47 American lives yesterday." Hayes nodded, his attention shifting to encompass the entire operations center. "Commander Torres, what I'm about to tell you is classified, but given recent events, operational security considerations have been overtaken by mission requirements." He moved to the main tactical display, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing operations at the highest levels. Task Force Black was disbanded 18 months ago, and its personnel were reassigned throughout the military to maintain cover for operations that remain classified. Lieutenant Commander Keene was one of our most accomplished pilots, with a mission record that includes deep reconnaissance operations in 3 different countries. The silence that followed was absolute. Sandra could see the recognition dawning on faces throughout the room as personnel realized they'd been working alongside someone whose real capabilities extended far beyond anything they'd imagined. Her assignment to Sentinel Base was intended to be routine logistics duty while her operational profile cooled down. Yesterday's events have made that cover untenable, which brings us to why I'm here. Hayes turned to face Sandra directly, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. "Viper, the Firebase Charlie mission has attracted attention at levels that make maintaining your current assignment impossible. Your cover is blown, your capabilities are revealed, and frankly, the military needs pilots with your skills in positions where they can be properly utilized." Sandra felt the familiar sensation of her life-changing direction without her input or consent. Military assignments were rarely requests, and she understood that Hayes wasn't here to offer her choices about her future. "What are my orders, sir?" "You're being reassigned to establish a new Special Operations Aviation Unit. Mountain warfare, deep reconnaissance, operations in denied territory where conventional support isn't available. You'll have your choice of personnel and equipment, and operational authority that extends directly to theater command level." The offer was everything Sandra had trained for, everything her experience had prepared her to accomplish. But she found herself looking around the operations center at the faces of people who'd become more than just colleagues during her brief time at Sentinel Base. "Sir," she said carefully, "I'd like to request that some personnel from this base be considered for the new unit. They've proven themselves capable of supporting operations at the highest level." Hayes smiled, the expression suggesting he'd expected exactly that response. "Already approved. Sergeant Cole has been selected for the maintenance team, and several others have been identified for specialist positions. We learned years ago that Task Force Black's success depended on having the right people in every position." As the briefing continued with discussions of timelines, equipment requirements, and operational parameters, Sandra felt the weight of transition settling on her shoulders. The quiet logistics pilot was gone forever, replaced by someone whose reputation would precede her to every future assignment. But when she looked through the operations center windows toward the flight line where Hawk 11 sat in the morning sunlight, she felt no regret about the transformation. The mission to Firebase Charlie had reminded her why she'd joined the military, why she'd accepted assignment to Task Force Black, and why some risks were worth taking when lives hung in the balance. Later that afternoon, as word of her reassignment spread through the base, Sandra found herself once again facing an impromptu gathering of personnel who'd come to express their respect for someone they'd underestimated. But this time, the atmosphere felt different, more like a celebration than a revelation. Master Sergeant Bradley stepped forward, carrying a small wooden plaque that bore the unofficial motto of Sentinel Base: "Excellence in support of those who serve." Below it, someone had added a new line: Viper, Firebase Charlie, November 2024. Ma'am, Bradley said, his voice carrying the formal cadence of military ceremony. This base has been home to many fine pilots over the years, but none of them will be remembered the way you will. You showed us what courage looks like when everything's on the line. As Sandra accepted the plaque, she felt the weight of recognition that came not from official commendations, but from the respect of professionals who understood the difference between routine competence and exceptional service. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "But I want you to remember that courage isn't a solo act. Every person here contributed to bringing those Marines home. The mechanics who kept aircraft flying, the communications personnel who maintained contact, the support staff who made everything else possible. Courage is a team effort." As the gathering dispersed and personnel returned to their duties, Sandra walked back toward Hawk 11 for one final inspection before her departure the following morning. The helicopter sat exactly where she'd left it, bearing the honorable scars of missions that had tested both aircraft and pilot beyond their supposed limits. She ran her hand along the fuselage one last time, feeling the metal skin that had protected her through storms and enemy fire. Tomorrow she would fly a different aircraft, begin a new assignment, and take responsibility for operations that would challenge everything she thought she knew about military aviation. But tonight, she would remember Firebase Charlie and 47 Americans who were alive because someone had been willing to fly into impossible weather when conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done. In her quarters that evening, Sandra packed the few personal belongings that had followed her from assignment to assignment throughout her career. The photograph of her and JTW went into the top of her kit bag, along with Lance Corporal Thompson's medic badge and the wooden plaque from Sentinel Base personnel. 3 items that told the story of her military service. The relationships that mattered, the lives that had been saved, and the recognition earned through actions rather than rank. When she thought about legacy, these were the things that would define her career, long after mission reports were filed and forgotten. Outside her window, the mountains stood silhouetted against a clear night sky, their peaks no longer hidden by the storms that had nearly claimed Firebase Charlie. Somewhere in those mountains, Rodriguez and his Marines were settling into defensive positions that would hold until reinforcements arrived, secure in the knowledge that they had enough ammunition to meet whatever challenges the next day might bring. And at Sentinel Base, personnel who'd learned to recognize excellence wherever they found it were preparing to support whatever missions tomorrow might require, carrying with them the knowledge that courage often came from the most unexpected places. The pilot they'd known as Lieutenant Commander Sandra Chen was gone, replaced by someone whose reputation would open doors and create opportunities throughout her remaining military career. But the woman who'd flown into a storm to save 47 Americans would remain, carrying forward the understanding that true service meant being ready to risk everything when others had no one else to call. The mountains kept their secrets, but the legend of Viper had been reborn, and the Dawn military was better for having officers willing to fly into the impossible when lives hung in the balance. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where are you watching from, and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget.